Good evening. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Ryan Flores. I am the Technical Services Manager at the Westchester Public Library, and I'd like to welcome back Sneed Collard. If you were with us in November, he presented on his book, Woodpeckers, Warblers and Woodpeckers.
Yeah, that's right.
Which was a very entertaining discussion in a book about a big year he did with his son. Sneed is back this evening to discuss some birding trips he's done in the Amazon, as well as to talk about some writing, how nature has affected his writing style. So Sneed, thank you again for joining us, and the Zoom is yours.
Hey, well, thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you for inviting me here again today. It's great to be back in Illinois, sort of at least, and speaking with all of you. I really had fun during my last session, and this session tonight, which is kind of tentatively titled Tropical Birding, is very appropriate because not only are we having kind of a tropical like thunderstorm here in Montana right this moment, but you guys in Illinois really are in the tropics throughout the summer. And so I've been very excited to give this talk. And of course, the tropics are just something that really interests me, as you will see in just a moment. What I'm going to do, let me just switch to the sharing screen here and play from the beginning. So as most of you know or just heard, I am a writer, and you probably know from my last visit with you that I'm also a birder. But not surprisingly, I did not grow up wanting to do either of those things. In fact, nobody ever really talked to me about birds when I was a young person, and I didn't really do much writing except maybe a story for my third grade teacher at one time. But what I did have growing up was were two parents who were biologists. My mother was a lifelong high school biology teacher, and she had a particular interest in marine mammals. My dad, meanwhile, was a biology professor at the University of West Florida. And I would spend my school years with my mom in California and then fly to spend the summers with my father. And there, I didn't develop an interest in birds, but I did develop an interest especially in reptiles. Because Florida, even though, it's not technically in the tropics, it still has that tropical diversity of reptiles that you see down there. And in fact, I think it was those long, kind of wet, humid summers down there that really got me interested in the tropics in general. But I didn't get to visit the tropics until I was 15 in person. And like my dad, my mom remarried, and she happened to marry one of the world's experts in fireflies. And back then, this was about 1975, my stepfather was doing research on fireflies in Southeast Asia. And when I was 15 years old, he took my mom and me with him. And this was my very first time out of the country and, like I mentioned, in the tropics. And from the moment I landed in Hong Kong, I just loved it. I loved that the food was different. I loved that the language was different. And just the feel of the air was different too. And this was just the first part of our trip. From Hong Kong, we flew to Malaysia, where I got to visit my first virgin tropical rainforest, which we called jungle back then. And from there, we flew to Bali and Thailand and Singapore. And I just loved it. And from then on, I've been passionately interested in the tropics. Also, this trip, though, may have jump-started my writing career, because I was so interested in everything that I began keeping a journal. and even continued writing in my journal after this trip was over, especially during other types of vacations. But by the time I finished high school, I still wasn't thinking about writing. I wasn't thinking about birds either. I didn't hesitate actually to study marine biology in college. And it wasn't until after I graduated that I began forging my writing career. My first book took about 10 years to get published. It was a book called Sea Snakes. And once it got published, one of the priorities I really set for myself was to go back to the tropics and write about them. Fortunately, I was working as a computer nerd at UC Santa Barbara at the time, and I met this woman named Nalini Ned Carney, who told me about a place in Costa Rica called Monte Verde. It was a place with a tropical cloud forest, a kind of forest I'd never heard of, but just one of many kinds of tropical forest. And I spent 2 months down there hanging out with scientists, climbing trees with Nalini. She studied these plants called epiphytes up in the tops of the trees, and went out bat netting with bat biologists. And this trip led into another trip a few years later to Australia, another tropical adventure. This time I visited the tropical rainforest, but also went out to a place called Lizard Island, where there was a biological research laboratory. And I went scuba diving with scientists, learned all about their work, just like I had done with the tropical cloud forest. A couple of years after that, I took another tropical adventure, this time to the Bahama Islands to go diving in a deep sea submersible. Why? To learn about bioluminescent animals, also in the tropics. And as you can imagine, all of these trips led to some books. I wrote a book called Monte Verde, Science and Scientists in a Costa Rican Cloud Forest, which is still one of the books I wrote that I'm most proud of. Book called Lizard Island followed that one. And for the deep sea adventure, I wrote In the Deep Sea. What a title, huh? What I never imagined, though, is how many other ideas these tropical adventures would give me. In fact, some of my most successful books were not the ones, these three that I just showed you. They were spin-off ideas, books like The Forest and the Cloud, which is a picture book, as is One Night in the Coral Sea. And books that even aren't about the tropics specifically, I've used tropical animals heavily in them. Picture books like Wings and Teeth, or my book Pocket Babies and Other Amazing Marsupials. And one of my most successful books, Sneed Be Colored III's most fun book ever about lizards. Now, you may be wondering, okay, when's he going to talk about birds? Because all through these books, I still was not a birder and still didn't know much about them. I had noticed a few books like a blue-crowned motmot when I went to learn about the Costa Rican cloud forest. And I had actually written a few books about birds. My most successful book I probably have ever written was called Beaks. It came out in about 1999. I also wrote a book called Birds of Prey, a look at daytime raptors. And the research for that book led me to write an adventure thriller called Flashpoint, which, by the way, is still out of print. But if you want a copy, you can contact me directly. I'll give you some details about that at the end of my talk. So I was writing about birds, but I didn't really begin to become a birder until I worked on my book, Firebirds, Valuing Natural Wildfires and Burned Forests, which is all about the importance of burned forest to woodpeckers and many, many other kinds of birds that really depend on this forest to survive, these burned forests. While I was researching this book, though, one thing I like to do when I write a book like this is take as many of the photos as I possibly can. And so my son Braden and I started going out into the burned forest, taking pictures, and learning about the birds that we were taking pictures of, often with his friend in the orange shirt here, a kid named Nick Ramsey. Both of them are in college, by the way, and still very good friends. But we started learning about our local birds and getting more and more interested in them. And then we watched a movie that I may have mentioned in my last talk called The Big Year, which if you've never seen it, do. It's a hilarious movie about these three avid birders who are trying to set the world record for how many species they can see in a calendar year in the US and Canada. And this movie inspired us to do our own big year a couple of years later. We left Montana to bird in Texas and Arizona and California. And it also led to the first book for adults that I ever wrote called Warblers and Woodpeckers, a Father-Son Big Year of Birding, which I discussed in detail during my last visit with all of you in Illinois. But oddly enough, we had never managed up until that time, even though we've been birding 4 or 5 years, we'd never managed to bird in the tropics. Well, all that was about to change because in 2017, my wife Amy and I decided that we were going to do something we'd always wanted to do, and that is take our kids, my son and my daughter, on an extended visit to a place that was truly different than the US. We decided to take them for 5 weeks to the countries of Ecuador and Peru. Now, it took a long time to get down there from Montana, especially because my horse was really slow. But once we got there, we didn't waste any time. First stop, the Amazon. We hopped a little plane from the capital of Ecuador, Quito, to a town called Coca, which is kind of Ecuador's gateway to the Amazon. Got on a boat, we headed down the Rio Napo, which is one of the huge tributaries of the Amazon River. And, you know, if you didn't tell me, if no one had told me it was a tributary, I would have thought that was the Amazon because it was so large, up to a mile across in places. Our destination, though, a place called the Sani Lodge. Now, this is one of several eco lodges that are down in that area, but we chose this one because it happened to be run by native tribes, and we wanted to support that and, you know, help them have a way to support themselves while conserving and protecting their area of rainforest that they were located on. And this proved to be a really good choice. Now, we didn't go there especially to see tropical birds, but you can imagine that from the moment my son Braden and I got there, birds were buzzing through our minds. In fact, at the lodge itself, there were all kinds of great tropical birds to be seen. My daughter Tessa immediately adopted this bird called a gray-winged trumpeter, which apparently are quite difficult to find, but this one had adopted the lodge as its home. But this was just one of dozens of species around the lodge. We saw things that we never had even dreamed of before, things called white-eared jacamars and masked crimson tanagers. We saw sun bitterns, and the bird you most often see in nature movies about the Amazon, the Watsin. Why do you see them so often? Because they tend to be really good at posing. And so they're very easy to take photographs of. On the river itself, the little part that we were on, we also saw lots of things like kingfishers and other water-related birds. Our first full day of being at the Sani Lodge, though, we did something that proved to be perhaps the best thing of the whole 5 weeks that we did. We got into a canoe with our guides, and they paddled us to this giant kapok tree. Kapok trees are famous. They're the tallest kinds of trees in the Amazon, and they live in many parts of the world. They're also called ceiba trees, and their seed pods were harvested for the cottony substance that's inside of them. In fact, all life rafts used to be made from these kapok seeds and the fluffy stuff inside of them. But we were there because the tribe and some other groups had happened to build a tower to the top of this kapok tree, about 200 feet high. And at the top, they had built an amazing viewing platform. And up here, we had great views of all around for miles of the Amazon. Of course, we didn't look at that right away. Why? Because there were so many tropical birds just in the canopy, in the branches around us. More amazing things we'd never seen, like blue dacnys and long-billed wood creepers. We saw green honey creepers, and one of my favorite birds, the pied puffbird. I just love that name, and that you can see what cute little birds that they are. We also, though, could see birds out at a distance in the tops of the surrounding trees. We saw things like rufous-bellied euphonias, black-headed parrots, many-banded araucaries, which look a lot like toucans and have this similar kind of bill, and things like crimson-crested woodpeckers. And then you looked even farther out to see more birds like hawks, and one bird I never thought I would ever see, a giant harpy eagle. Now, you're probably wondering why this is such a lousy photo. It's because this bird was more than 2 miles away. It was just a little tiny lump on the top of a tree. And one of our guides spotted it through the spotting scope and took this picture by holding my wife's iPhone up to the lens of the spotting scope and took a picture that way. So this was just an amazing, amazing experience. Now, of course, in the Amazon, we weren't just looking for birds. We saw lots of other amazing animals like pygmy marmosets, the world's smallest monkeys. They're only about this long, not including their tails. We saw giant spiders about the size of my hand. That's no exaggeration, this tarantula. Black caimans, which are up to about 14 feet long. This one was probably only 9 or 10 feet long, but long enough that we didn't feel too comfortable swimming in the water hole next to the lodge. And we saw things I'd never even heard of, like a caiman lizard, which is a kind of lizard that mimics the caiman lifestyle in the water. So I will tell you that this trip to the Amazon was not all fun and games, however. At one point, we ran out of food and had to eat live beetle grubs to feed ourselves. And actually, we didn't run out of food, but I'd always wanted to eat one of these because people told me that they had a nice nutty flavor. Now, to eat one, what you have to do is you have to bite it behind its jaws because it has these big mandibles that can pinch you. So you bite behind and that severs its spinal cord, and then you pop the whole thing in your mouth. Did it taste delightful and nutty? No. It tasted like a big bag full of snot. But the roasted versions of them tasted much better. So if you're going to eat one of these beetle grubs, I highly recommend roasting it first. At another point during our visit, we got attacked by this savage group of eggplants and had to fend them off with a blowgun. You can see I was quite proud of helping to defend the lodge there. But all too soon, our stay at the lodge ended, and we had to head back to Quito to continue the rest of our adventure. Nice thing about this trip, though, is everywhere we went, we saw amazing tropical wildlife, especially birds. We stayed in the town of Cusco for 2 weeks doing a homestay and language class. And then we headed off to a place that many people like to go to. You probably know what it is. It's called Machu Picchu. And unfortunately, we went during particularly cloudy, rainy day, which happens a lot there. In fact, and even worse, my daughter had a terrible cold. So after we did a quick tour of the ruins here, my wife took my daughter back to our hotel, and Braden and I continued to explore, especially looking for birds. And surprisingly, we saw amazing birds right at Machu Picchu. We saw Andean guans, which are look kind of like game birds to me. They're bigger birds and often up in the trees. Saw beautiful songbirds like tricolored brush finches, saffron-crowned tanagers, blue-capped tanagers. And then we headed back to town. And we're walking around the town. We happened to go into this one hotel and ran into another birder. And he said, and this was on the hotel grounds, and he said, well, have you seen an Andean cock of the rock yet? This is probably the most famous bird in Peru. They're bright orange and spectacular. And unfortunately, to see them, you often have to take a special tour and get up at like 4 a.m, drive 2 hours to one of their leks where the males show up for females. And we told him, no, we probably weren't going to get a chance to do that on this trip. But he said, oh, you haven't seen one? Well, turn around. We did, and right behind us in a tree was one of these Andean cock of the rocks. These are large birds. They're probably about pigeon-sized, maybe even a little bigger. And in a nearby tree was the female just hanging out there too. So we felt extremely fortunate to just kind of blunder into this most famous bird of Peru, which is actually, I believe, the national bird of Peru, even though it hasn't been formally declared that I know of. So this was close to the end of our adventure, but not quite. We flew back to Ecuador to another great birding spot, which actually is flying out my brain right now, but I will remember it before the end of the talk. And this was another great birding spot where we saw more amazing tropical birds like Guayaquil woodpeckers. Oh, the place was Mindo. That's what it is. And it's famous for birding, for birders. We saw velvet purple coronets, crimson rump toucanets, and yet even more amazing tanagers. I have to tell you that if you don't know much about tropical birding, tanagers are one of the big groups that you see in South America. There's more than 200 species, and only a handful of those ever reach North America. But down there, they are mind-blowing. They include flame-faced tanagers, golden tanagers, black-capped tanagers, and many, many more species. So that kind of wrapped up our adventure down in Peru and in Ecuador. But if you think that these adventures may have inspired some books, you would be absolutely correct. Seeing all the brightly colored tropical birds down there, in fact, inspired me to write a picture book called Birds of Every Color. And as I've done with some of my other picture books, I wrote it at 2 levels of text. I have a big text, such as birds get colors from foods and make them on their own. And this creates a nice story time, read aloud text for young readers. But I also put more details so that your older kids can learn what exactly I'm talking about with each of these big sentences that I have here. And most of the birds in this book came from that trip we took to South America. But this trip also inspired me in other ways, these tropical birds. I went back and I wrote this book called Woodpeckers, which I had been meaning to write for years. And because of our trip to the tropics, I was able to include a spread about specifically tropical woodpeckers, birds that we saw on our trip down there. And you can see how different a lot of them look. Like we have things that kind of look like a black-cheeked woodpecker, but this cream-colored woodpecker, wow, that blew our minds when we saw that. We didn't know anything like that existed. As I've talked about, I believe in my last talk, I also was inspired to write a book called Waiting for a Warbler. And this is a picture book about the many tropical species that migrate to North America every year. And you can see that the bird that I chose to focus on for this book was the cerulean warbler. And this beautiful map from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology shows that in winter, they are basically tropical birds, but only in the summer do they come up to the United States to breed. And you can see that you got some right in Illinois. So I hope that some of you are lucky enough to see those. Since our South America adventure, we have had other adventures that we took. Actually, we were able to go to the Galapagos to see some tropical birds before we actually went to Ecuador and Peru, or the other parts of Ecuador. Just before the pandemic, my son and I got to do some more tropical birding in Israel, where I was invited to speak at some schools there. And Israel is very interesting because it has a temperate zone, but if you go down south to the Red Sea, it's all tropical. And our family actually got to visit Taiwan a few years ago too, and see a few other tropical birds, though this was right at the beginning of when Braden and I were getting into birds, so we did not really appreciate them like we should have. Now with that, I want to shift topics a little bit. Hopefully I've gotten some of you interested in birding in the tropics. And you may be wondering, well, how easy is it to do that on your own? And let me assure you, you do not have to rent your own camels and explore the tropics on your own. There's a couple of really good ways to bird the tropics if you're a beginning birder. One is to take a cruise. As I mentioned, you saw that picture of the blue-footed booby. That, as a family, we got to take a Galapagos cruise. And I highly recommend that. In fact, it had been on my bucket list for decades before we were able to do that. And that was just a really enjoyable way to see tropical birds. And they have, this was a National Geographic cruise, so they had naturalists on board, but most cruises do. And so if you want to take a cruise, find out the bird expert on that cruise and just make him show you some birds, or make her show you some birds. Another way to do tropical birding is what I showed you earlier, and that is to go to a lodge. The Sani Lodge is one that I highly recommend. It's S-A-N-I. And let me see if I have, I will write that down later. But they took really good care of us. And once we got to Quito, in fact, they arranged all the air and boat transportation down to their lodge. So all we had to do was get to the Quito airport in the morning. One of their hosts grabbed us right there, helped us through security and onto the plane. And another one met us in Coca, the town we flew to get on the boat. So that's also a really great way to see this, and not nearly as difficult and harrowing as you might imagine. In fact, it was all fairly stress-free. You can also just pick a town like Mindo that's known for birding. We just booked a lodge from, I think we went to TripAdvisor and looked up the ratings of lodges in Mindo, and smart lodges mention birds. And in fact, when I booked our trip, I told the host that we were interested in birding, and he said, "Oh, well, would you like me to arrange a guide for you?" And we said, "Sure." And so we went out with a guide while we were there. And in fact, using guides is really a great way to go too. We hired guides in several different places. How did we find them? Well, we just got on the internet and we looked up bird guiding in Quito or bird guiding in Cusco. And this might seem scary, you know, with Americans, we're very fearful when we tend to go abroad, but usually they have some quotes from satisfied customers, and they pick you up in their car and they take you around. And this was really some of the most fun things that we did when we were down there in South America. But what if you can't go to the tropics yourself to do tropical birding? Well, I've got good news for you, because you can do tropical birding right here in the United States. In fact, we have several states here that you can find great tropical birds in without ever leaving the country. During my son and my big year, we went to Arizona and Texas, which are well known for their tropical birds that come over the border there. And in fact, we went back to Texas another time because we were so enchanted by the truly different kinds of birds there. Florida is also a great place to find tropical birds, and so is actually Southern California, which has quite a few. Talking about birds actually is making me want to sneeze a little bit. Excuse me just a second. It must be all that feather dust that has been gathering around my computer from the tropical birds here. But anyway, I highly recommend tropical birding right here in the United States. Texas actually has this wonderful series of birding trail maps that they've done for each part of the state. And if you're brave while you're down there, you can even cross over into Mexico, which is what Braden and I did when we were down there, just to get a Mexico bird list while we were there. Hawaii, of course, is great for tropical birds. I've been a couple times, but before I was a birder. However, Braden went back with his band in high school and got a lot of great tropical birds there. Now in Hawaii, it's a weird situation because most of the birds are introduced and it's very difficult to see the native tropical birds. But even if you don't manage that, there are tropical birds swarming all around you. So lots of options without ever leaving the country. But even better news is that here in the United States, tropical birds come to us, especially in Illinois, where you are now. Every summer, you've got dozens, if not hundreds, of migrating birds that come through. And down in Texas, you get things like green jays, which are there most of the year. Actually not most of the year, but a lot of the year. No, I was right the first time. They are year-round residents. You can see in southern Texas, as are some other tropical birds. But many of the birds just come through seasonally. In fact, just a few weeks ago, my son, he got a job for the summer looking for northern goshawks in the Sierras, and he happened to decide to do his own big year this year, trying to crack 400 species for the year. So I told him, I said, well, what if I just drive you to your job? And so we decided to drive through Arizona, which is an amazing place for tropical birds. There are things like vermilion flycatchers, which are pretty widespread actually in the southwestern United States. But then you have amazing things like these migrating warblers, like the painted redstarts. And you have birds like varied buntings and red-faced warblers. And by the way, the painted redstart is also a warbler. And you get even tropical raptors down in Arizona, like the zone-tailed hawk. And this is the bird that everyone especially wants to see when they go to Arizona. Can you guess what it is? Well, this is called an elegant trogon. And they actually breed in these in these, what do they call them? They call them islands in the sky, or sky island habitats, which are just elevated mountain ranges in southern Arizona, where a lot of these tropical birds end up breeding. And we saw one of these while we were down in Arizona recently. And you can see it only comes there in the summertime to breed. The rest of the year, it ranges down through Mexico and Central America. But like I said, letting the birds come to you is a great way to see tropical birds, especially in the springtime. Here in Montana, we have things like western tanagers, which are a truly tropical bird. You see, they also are denizens of Mexico and Central America, but they migrate up throughout much of the West to breed in the summertime. Ditto for our oriole that we have here, called a Bullock's oriole. You can see it's also a resident of Mexico, but breeds through much of the western half of the United States. Now, you guys in Illinois get things like black and white warblers, and you can see their distributions here. They're also, they do spend the winter, some of them in Texas and Florida, but mostly they're South and Central American and Mexico. But they have a huge breeding range throughout the Midwest and up into Canada. We have to drive all the way to northeastern Montana to even get a chance at seeing one of these things. But you guys, at least in southern Illinois, should have quite a few of them. Or I guess you could just travel north to maybe catch a game in Milwaukee and do some birding while you are there. Many other warblers follow a similar routine, such as chestnut-sided warblers, which breed right in the Chicago area, you can see there. So you probably have them very close to you right now. And then there are things like black-throated blue warblers and northern parulas, which are also warblers, and non-warblers that are also migrants, such as rose-breasted grosbeaks. You can see they should be all around you right now in Illinois. In fact, one of the things that Braden and I always dreamed about doing was to bird Central Park in New York in the spring, because it's well known for getting a variety of tropical birds, and as they're migrating through onto their breeding areas elsewhere. And in fact, we got to do this just this last spring. And it was just an amazing time. If you ever want to visit New York, go see some plays, try to spend a week in the height of the migration season, which should be about early May. You can get up early, go bird Central Park, and then go see a show at night. It's a delightful, if slightly expensive thing or way to see New York. Now, I continue to keep birding and to write more books about birds and other things. I also, with Braden, I write a blog called fathersonbirding.com. And if you want to reach me, you can get to me through Father Son Birding or my regular website, which is sneedbcollared3rd.com. I also, if any of you are teachers interested in a school visit, I do a lot of school visits around my books. Here's one that I did in Israel right before the pandemic. But I also conduct writing workshops with kids. I give lectures like this one that you're seeing now. And recently, my passion for birding has led people to ask me to lead field trips. This spring, I got to take out a school in my area on a couple of different field trips to go birding. And the kids just had a blast. In fact, birds not only are fascinating in themselves, they're such a great way to get young people off of their devices and out into nature. And in the greater Chicago area, you just got so many incredible parks and other resources where you can go birding. So I hope that today's talk inspired you somewhat, maybe to visit the tropics yourself. but if not, to take advantage of the tropical birds that are all around you for 3 or 4 months of the year. And with that, that is most of what I wanted to share with you tonight. I do have a new book that just came out a couple of weeks ago. It's called, or a couple months ago, it's called Little Killers, The Ferocious Lives of Puny Predators. And it has no birds in it. So if you just want bird books, you'll be disappointed. But it's a nice window into the little tiny predators that most of us overlook most of the time. And so that's a fun one. I also have several other books coming out in the next couple of years. I'll get to do a little semi-tropical birding myself this fall when I go to Florida to research a book about conservation on military bases. And so you can bet that I will be doing a lot of birding while I'm down there. So that's most of what I wanted to cover. I do see that we've got a question here in the chat room. And if any of you are listening and want to post some chat questions for me, I'd be happy to answer those. This question here is, have I ever visited the rainforest in Puerto Rico called El Yunque? And the questioner, Ginny, is wondering how different it is from Costa Rica. And actually, I have been to El Yunque, but again, before I was a birder. In fact, I can't even remember if I saw the famous Puerto Rican parrots that live mainly in El Yunque there, El Yunque. The forest there, so at first glance, it looks pretty similar to other tropical forests. But what you find in the Caribbean is that the plant and animal diversity is quite a bit lower than you would see in Central or South America. I think a lot of it's just the island effect. You've got, it's tough to get to islands. You know, birds don't have any problems a lot of times, but plants do. And so you look at the history of Hawaii, of Puerto Rico, of almost any other island, and you'll see that there aren't as many plant species as you might get in the mainland kinds of tropics. But the other cool thing that happens on islands is a traveler, like a bird or a lizard, will get there, and then without any other real competition, it kind of evolves into its own species. You see that a lot in the Galapagos. In fact, that's, to me, one of the best reasons to take a Galapagos cruise, because these animals, the islands are so far away from the mainland that it's been very limiting what's gotten there, and whatever does get there evolves into these great, unique species, often found nowhere else on Earth. And Puerto Rico does have some examples of that too. So yeah, so it sounds like you've probably been to El Yunque, which makes me happy. By the way, I have a friend in Puerto Rico, and I asked him recently how the island and how El Yunque especially was impacted by the hurricanes that have come through. And apparently these hurricanes, as you probably saw in the news, were just devastating. I mean, my friend said he went out of his house after a couple of days and there was not a leaf on a tree. Fortunately, a lot of these plants have rebounded nicely, and they did protect these endangered Puerto Rican parrots. In fact, I think most of them were actually housed safely during the hurricane. They went out and caught them quickly. But there was also a wild group that was not in El Yunque that did survive the hurricane. So that's really good news. All right, well, does anyone else have some questions for me that they would like to ask?
Well, we had some in the live stream. So
good, yeah.
Yeah, if anyone still wants to add them to the chat, please do. But we had someone ask, you had mentioned in the beginning of the discussion about a tropical cloud forest. What is the difference between that and a tropical rainforest, or is there a difference?
So, we all think of tropical rainforest as basically being one thing, but there are actually dozens and dozens of kinds of tropical forests. Like in Costa Rica alone, there are lowland tropical rainforests. Well, actually, it gets more specific than that. There's lowland Pacific tropical rainforests, lowland Atlantic tropical rainforests. There's dry tropical forests, and many, many other kinds. And Monteverde happens to be one called a tropical cloud forest, but even that really doesn't tell the whole story, because you'll find tropical cloud forest in other parts of the world too, but they're totally different. What makes them tropical cloud forest is that they are forests that evolved getting enshrouded in clouds and mist almost every day of the year. And that means that water is not as limiting there, because many of the plants are adapted to actually grab this mist, these cloud water out of the air and get nurtured by it. That's also, though, a reason why tackling climate change is so urgent for us to do. And that is because it's having impacts on all of these ecosystems. In Monteverde, the extra heat is pushing the clouds higher up above the mountains. And so this rainforest is no longer bathed in these nurturing clouds that it needs anymore. And so if you haven't yet joined a conservation group that's active tackling climate change, I urge you to do that, as well as write to your congresspeople and senators and just let them know that this is a life or death situation for us, because we're losing species as we speak because of these dramatic changes caused by Earth's warming temperatures. Yeah.
We had another one. In addition to the birds you mentioned that you photographed, you discussed other animals. The examples I think you gave were the caiman and the tarantula.
Mm-hmm.
How is photographing them different from birds? Is it as much waiting, or is it?
Well, I have to tell you that I'm basically an opportunistic photographer. I do not generally go out there and sit in a bird blind for hours and hours waiting for a bird to appear. Nice thing about the tropics is there are so many birds that you can choose what generally one is going to be perched next to you at any given time. And so that makes it a lot easier. Those three really beautiful tanagers I showed you from Mindo, though, people often also set up bird feeders that you can go to, and you can just sit there with your camera on your tripod and take these marvelous photos of birds that are maybe 20 feet away, 30 feet away. Same with hummingbird feeders as well. But other animals, I would say in general, when you see them, they're a bit easier to photograph than birds are, because birds are always moving around, and they're going into the shade and out into the sun, and if they think you're looking at them too hard, they will fly away, most of them. In fact, I had a discussion with another birder not long ago, and he said, I really think that birds know when you've pointed a camera at them. And I think he's right, because many birds will just be sitting there, and as soon as you even turn them or raise your binoculars, they leave. They have an amazing awareness of what's going on around them. So like I said, if I go and need photos for a book, I will try to find some nests of birds where the parents are coming back and forth, and I'll just set up my tripod and wait a while for that. But often I just am taking birds as I go. And often what inspires me to write a book, bird book, actually, is when I have enough photos to do it. So, yeah. Any other questions?
This one you kind of already answered, but I'll address it again. Uh, do you think you'll go back to the tropics, more specifically South America?
Do I think what? I'm sorry.
Do you think you'll go back to the tropics and more specifically South America? I know you mentioned you were going to the military base.
Yeah, yeah, in Florida. I would love to go back to the tropics, and I think I'll get to. You know, I'm 62 now, though, and you just really can't take anything for granted. But I hope that I'll have a chance to go back. Now, my son, on the other hand, he is studying at the University of Maine right now, and I've no doubt he's going to focus on birds eventually. He already is, actually. And he, in recent discussions I've had with him, like the last year or two, he would actually like to specialize on South American birds. And so that means, of course, he'll be going down there either to study or do research or both. And if he ends up down there for a year, I will jump on that opportunity and head down there to visit him for sure.
Okay, and then I think we had one more from the live stream.
Sure.
Are there any other areas or ecosystems that you'd like to do birding at?
Oh, yeah, countless almost. As I mentioned, most of my traveling I did in life was before I became a birder, much to my regret now. But, you know, you can only do what you can do. I would love to go back to Africa. I've only been to Ethiopia before, and I did see some birds there. But I would love to go to South Africa and see the birds that they have there, the vultures, the penguins, weird birds like the secretary bird. So I'd love to go there. I'd also really like to go back to Australia and just bird there for a month or 3 months or a year or whatever I can do. And then there are some places where I've never really noticed birds at all. Alaska, if you're an American birder, you've got to go to Alaska because not only do they have things in the main part of Alaska that are fascinating, but if you go out on the Aleutian chain there, they get birds flying over from Asia. And so you get this nice sampling of Asian birds out there. So I'd love to do that. Love to, just before COVID, a buddy who I got into birding, and I had a trip planned to Mexico. We were going to drive down there from Nogales with a Mexican colleague of his and a bird for 3 or 4 days, but that got canceled, and I hope that can happen again sometime. Meanwhile, there's lots of places in the US I've never birded as well. Ohio has this huge migrating bird festival every year there that's world famous for seeing warblers especially. And I'm guessing Illinois has some amazing spring birding spots as well along the lake. And so yeah, I'd love to really hit the Midwest sometime as well.
Yeah, I believe Montrose Harbor is a pretty famous international spot around here.
Oh, how far from Chicago is it?
Oh, it's either in Chicago or Evanston. I'm not entirely sure, but it's just right along the lake, and I guess it's known internationally as just kind of a good spot. How the harbor was naturally formed, I believe.
Oh, yeah. And it's so great, you know, Illinois is also, I mean, Chicago is also world famous for its park system there. And I'm guessing you've just got so many opportunities to see birds and other wildlife. In fact, a new picture book I just pitched is that it has not been sold yet, but I would like to write a book about urban wildlife. And of course, Chicago's coyotes are world famous.
Yeah.
And so that one will definitely make it into the book if I get a contract for this title. So I'll keep you posted.
Yeah, please do. Let me just check if there's anything else in the live stream.
Okay.
I think that was it. So thank you very much again, Sneed. It's a pleasure having you. We hope.
Oh, I enjoyed it. And yeah, I'll come back anytime. And I want to hear some reports from some of you about the birds you're seeing after this talk too.
Will do. I know some of people watching have kids that like to do some birding.
Oh, good.
We have done some photography programs here at the library. We have a prairie nearby, so we've tried to get some good shots of birds.
That's such a nice way too to get into birding is through photography. In fact, I'd say half the birders I know are also avid photographers. The things just go together so well. And it can be a big part of your enjoyment when you go out there too. So that's great. That's just great. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me, and bird on and keep reading great books.
Yep. Thank you so much. And we hope to have you again in the future.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you all for joining us. Good night.